Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight Jaron Zimmerman. And you're here in lieu of Dr. Buck Melton, who is, I would consider him sort of a senior citizen. I mean, he's up in age. I think we have to say that. And so we'll get maybe a different viewpoint from you, Jaron, about the way the world goes. So you are 19 years old, is that right? Wow.
Yes, sir.
And you're an intelligent observer of the world. Can one say that?
I'd hope so.
And let's talk about some things. So if you're 19 years old, you're part of Generation Z. What do you think's wrong with the world? We'll start with that.
Oh, that is... Sorry, that's a very loaded question, obviously.
Well, all young people think there's something wrong. Even old people think that.
I think, I think we spend most of our day looking at flaws, which, as with everything going on, especially with COVID and all that, it makes sense. A lot of flaws have been exposed, if that's the right word. I think there's a lot more division than has been, at least in the last 50 or so years right now. And I think that's probably one of our larger issues, maybe, although that's pretty centered in the U.S. Worldwide, our issue, I don't know if there's a single large issue, honestly. I think it's a lot of small things that have kind of added up lately. And I think that all of the fiasco going on in Europe right now is kind of showing that a lot of countries really don't know where they stand with each other. And we're seeing a lot of, not necessarily backstabbing, but a lot of countries that have said they would defend each other, said they would help each other, not really do that. And I think that might be telling that maybe we're heading towards a more isolationist future, or possibly this is the kick that we need to unify a lot more.
Isn't this the age of inclusion? I mean, this is just, it doesn't go past national boundaries. Is that right? So can you, in other words, that's part of the, an ideal in the U.S. is everybody has a place at the table, but it stops at the nation-state border. Do you any thoughts about that?
Oh, so now we're getting kind of towards the idea of nation states and boundaries. I think is it's not outdated's the wrong word. Obviously, boundaries are always going to be somewhat built into us, but I think the world needs to become more unified. I think that these ideas of strict boundaries and borders are not necessarily a thing of the past, but they're very much leading. They're very much hurting progression. They're very much keeping us not necessarily stagnant. But I think that this is the time of inclusion. This is the time that we should be working more towards unifying, not just within countries, but within continents, within the world itself. And I think that does need to start a lot more so than it is already. Like you can look at Europe. Europe has pretty much opened all of their borders just about, and although that has led to some economic issues, obviously Greece wasn't exactly the greatest inclusion there. But I think this needs to be the time of inclusion. It may not be yet, but I think that is where we need to go towards.
Well, let's think about that. We had the New World Order, which was the great hope after the Soviet Union imploded, and it doesn't look like it's worked out. And there have been times, particularly after national conflicts, that people sort of say, why can't we get along? What is it that's keeping us apart? We have one small world here. We're all the same species. Why can't we all be friends? And it appears that we cannot be. Is that do you have hope that things might get better as far as brotherhood and sort of fellow feeling?
I think hope is 100% necessary. I think you have to have hope. I tend to be a little more cynical. Obviously, I'm a history major. I just did an entire class on just the long 19th century. Like, I understand, like the world has existed for thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, and these cultures have had issues for millennia. So a lot of these problems between nations, these things that keep everyone from, quote, like being friends, a lot of them are like deep-seated grudges. A lot of them are issues largely with the past. But that isn't the whole picture. That's a lot of issues, a lot of a lot of friction between nations. But there is also always the issue of nations have I think it's more the elites of nations tend to cause a lot of those problems.
You think the people want peace and the leaders want war?
I think historically it's been more true. Yes, I think it may not be just that. Like, I don't think it's that if the elites didn't do anything, everyone would get along. I think it's a lot more that the elites aren't getting along, and the media and the government intentionally wants its people to not necessarily get along with everyone, whether this is intentional or subconscious. Obviously, we've seen things like this in history where nations have intentionally created conflict between their people with other nations to justify invasions, to justify wars or sanctions. And I think that never ended. We may be doing it a little smarter, we may be doing it a little slyer, where we aren't just straight up issuing massive propaganda like we did maybe in World War II or in the Spanish-American War, or where during a lot of those 19th century conflicts, the Balkans especially, had a lot of propaganda going on. I don't think it's something necessarily like that. I think it is a lot more subversive. I think it's just kind of baked into nations nowadays, especially our own, to stand with each other, not with them. And I don't think that is something that can be fixed like that. I don't think it's a quick and instant change. I think it is something that hopefully will be worked on over the next few hundred years. I think that I will probably die long before there is any meaningful change on that front. But I think, maybe a few generations down the line, they start seeing a better future and a better future. Because, 300, 400 years ago is completely unrecognizable to today. And I think that 300, 400 years in the future, we will be even more unified than we were today, and just as we are more unified today than we were then.
Well, so there's a certain, I detect a bit of hope in some of your thoughts. Well, if you have these hopes and there are these problems that exist, is America's democratic system going to take care of these problems?
Can you say more what you mean by that real quick? Sorry, before
Hit the
I
ball
answer.
back. Well, in other words, we have all these problems exist, and the great hope, so to speak, would be democracy. And we also have, in your comment here, the elites are roaming around. So are the elites going to pervert democracy, or is democracy just subject to the whims of our Neolithic brains? People might do wicked things at the ballot box. The wisdom of crowds may not always be wisdom. There may be bad things that come out of the democratic system. So in trying to chart our course here, is democracy the answer, if I could put it that way? That explained it slightly more.
Yeah, thank you. I think democracy is, I think democracy is, it's great. It should stick around. It's pretty much the only system that keeps us from killing each other, just about. It may not be the only system that works, obviously, but it is the system right now that is providing, at the very least, the most hope in our people. I think Thomas Jefferson was really right when he was talking about, or not Thomas Jefferson, sorry, Hamilton. I completely flipped that. Hamilton was right, when he was talking about the will of the people isn't necessarily always going to be what's right. But I think right now our democracy has been kind of manipulated really heavily by these extraordinarily powerful people who are pretty much just using it for their own will. And I think that probably won't change anytime soon. And I don't think it can change until there is either massive movements among the people, or if these elites suddenly, realize, oh, hey, this is probably not good. But obviously that's never going to happen. I think we should hope that democracy will eventually prevail. We should hope that our systems of government eventually start working the way they need to. But I think that there needs to be a lot more change, especially like with the way our government functions. Obviously, I'm young. I still have a lot to learn, a lot to see. But I think at least my generation tends to be more trying to move towards like actual change in the systems of government, not just in the people running the government, which even culminated with kind of a big push to start not necessarily rewriting, but much heavier amendments to the Constitution, which, that's for better or worse.
Do you think I'll push this thought a little bit. So the country is going through, as countries do, a lot of reassessment about its history, its values, and many people put the American flag up on the 4th of July. They take pride in the country's past, and yet many people point to all the defects in policy and all the sins that have occurred in the past. And if you're a young person and you're going to at one day fly the airplane, I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, about your history major, assessing history and trying to extract wisdom from the past to fly the airplane in the future. What are your comments? Is there, in regards to America's history, is it something you'd call wicked? Something that has good points, bad points? Should the country really, as many people do, despise its eras so much so that it becomes difficult to, I guess, stand up for the American flag when it passes by? Do you have any thoughts about that? So what I'm pursuing is that many younger people are rejecting the traditional values, if you would want to say that sort of kept the ship afloat. And what are your thoughts about that?
I think this is a really complicated issue. So I personally, obviously, I grew up in Warner Robins, which is a military town. So I grew up around a lot of veterans. Both my grandfathers are veterans. Grandfather on my mother's side actually fought in Vietnam. So obviously, when it comes to things like when people are like kneeling during the pledge or the anthem, like obviously I don't do that. Like I don't kneel during the anthem just because I was raised more in a town where the anthem isn't necessarily for your country. It is a lot more to honor the soldiers and the troops, which obviously that isn't its entire purpose, but growing up in that town, that's pretty much what it means to a lot of people here. And that's not what it means to people everywhere. A lot of people see the anthem or the pledge more as something promoting our country, not something promoting the troops. And so I sympathize with people not wanting to support that because a lot of people have issues with our nation. I think historically, the U.S. has not been pure wicked, nor has it been pure good. Like most countries, it has had a lot of faults, and it's had a lot of really awful things, which obviously you can't change that today. Like that happened. You have to respect that. You have to see that that happened, and it's foolish to say something like America's always been great, it's never done anything wrong. I think that's very foolish because obviously countries aren't always helmed by the best of people, nor are systems always going to be perfect. I mean, things are they're products of their time, and maybe the U.S. was further behind in some areas than other nations, obviously, but that happens. And obviously, I don't look back at, say, 1950s America and go, yeah, this was perfect, this was wonderful, because obviously there were horrible things going on then. I don't look back at, say, Spanish-American War or the issues in the Philippines or in Central America and go, oh yeah, the U.S. did nothing wrong here, because they did. But I also can't look back at our history and think the U.S. never did anything good, because, we're still a nation that has done good for the world. So I don't necessarily stand with people completely demonizing the U.S. I do tend to be a more cynical person, so I do tend to see a lot of the faults, a lot more issues with things our nation has done in the past. But I think that's actually a good thing. I think that the people should be holding their nation accountable for their mistakes in the past and their mistakes in the present, because when nations are made up of a bunch of people that blindly follow their nation, blindly trust these charismatic leaders, and just go along with everything happening and just support their nation fully, you end up with things like the Third Reich. You end up with these awful events that really could have been prevented if it wasn't for nations blindly following what the elites are saying. And I think that it is a very good thing when you can, and because you actually can in this country, freedom of speech and all that, when you can question what your nation is doing and when you can do something about it, or at the very least try to. So I think this is a decently complicated issue, because I kind of have to side with both sides of where people don't want to disrespect their nation, they don't want to disrespect the people that have fought for it, but also they don't want to prop up and support a nation that has historically committed a lot of atrocities, because you can't ignore that.
Now, you mentioned free speech. That's rather complicated, isn't it? So do you think, there's, I think particularly on campuses or in general, people want safe zones where they're not going to be subjected to contrary thoughts. I don't want, and I would submit that's probably pretty natural. If people watch whatever television, I don't know. I guess there's a Fox and CNN or whatever else, and so people, it's very uncomfortable for people to try and be exposed to any other viewpoint. It's very, takes a lot of, I guess, intellectual courage to do it. And so people don't routinely do that. And so and indeed, if I'll ask this question, do you think you feel easy to present unpopular opinions? Or do you think people accept that? I mean, if somebody said something to you you disagreed with, they'd get some message from you not to continue with it. So how much free speech is there among young people? I mean, maybe with old people there's also not much free speech, but what are your comments on that?
I actually think you are kind of getting onto an actual issue in our generation, which is very much, we're a very polarized generation. I think not so much in that it is like a 50-50 split. I think much more of our generation tends to lean towards these more progressive ideals, but they have a very hard time getting along with people that don't necessarily agree. And I kind of understand why that is. There's a lot of issues where, say I have two classmates and they're arguing. One of the classmates may be trying to invalidate the other's existence, like on a literal, on a basic level. And it's really hard to get along with someone who would say, doesn't believe that you should exist as you are, doesn't believe that certain things should exist as they are. Like, it's decently hard to get along with something like that. And I think I do a much better job at it, but that might just be because, I don't exactly fall into any of the categories that people try and get to not exist. So I think I'm kind of in a unique spot where it's a lot easier for me to still have these arguments and be decently civil, whereas I have a lot of friends who cannot speak to people like that, because those interactions, even if they start out as friendly, never stay friendly. And I think that is a big issue, but I don't think that is an issue that can really be changed, because, quite frankly, until one party becomes more inclusive or one party stops existing, they aren't ever going to be able to mesh. And I don't think that was as huge of an issue in the past, mostly because in the past people were a lot more closeted, a lot more reserved, and a much larger majority of the population fell on the other side. And I think that with all that changing, it has just led to a lot more conflicts among our generation. And I don't love that, because I have a lot of friends who, fall on either side pretty much. I'm a history major. I'm poli-sci. A lot of my friends are very in tuned with politics, as you might say. They're very active, and so I have friends that share very different beliefs, and I may have a lot of very civil arguments or conversations, debates, even with these people, but that I have that privilege, and I know people that don't necessarily have that privilege because those conversations can't stay civil. And I'm trying to tiptoe around the issues here.
I see. Well, now I'll just present this thought, is that when you're friends, you're having these conversations, do you think it's uniformly truth-seeking? Can you enter into a conversation with a person where your ego, your personal, I guess, id, strength, when it's phrased that way, is not involved in the conversation? So, I think one has to remember that speech is a form of aggression, if one wants to say that. So speech enables you to secure whatever food, if you want to say whatever. Speech is a way of getting things and also defending your sort of home and hearth. And so in general, it's unusual, I would say, to have a situation where people really say, well, let's just discuss what do we think is true, and we're going to enter into the conversation with our own ego, or the things that would buttress our worth as humans, or establish some kind of a mammalian dominance over other people in the room. In other words, if you got into a debate and you sort of smashed your opponent, just smashed them, and you could, there'd be some kind of primordial, I guess, feeling of superiority that people pursue. So I guess my comment is that the difficulty that takes place everywhere, but I would say particularly among young people that are trying to find their way through a disordered and crowded world, that they rarely will be neutral enough to say what is true, and why do you think that? What is the reason for that? And then ultimately what we get into is a system of conflicting values, and that becomes a very difficult way to resolve this. If your values are, I don't know, I want the Georgia Bulldogs to win the game, and some other person says, well, my values are, I want the, Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets to win. So if you, you finally get down to that, any conversation almost ends. Now, I think as the young people go forward, you're going to try and seize the world, if one can say that, as you inevitably will. What kind of lessons do you think the past generations have given you, the mistakes they've made? So what kind of mistakes need to be rectified? I mean, we mentioned a few. Apparently elites are bad, or they can do things, but I don't know, whatever. I don't know and foreign policy can be a problem. And how about absence of economic equality, or freedom limitations, or nation state problems? I'll throw a couple of thoughts out.
I want to touch on just about the first thing you said when it comes to people being able to sit down and kind of keep their egos in check. I think that is kind of uncommon nowadays. I think it's a skill you have to learn to be able to subdue the id, essentially, and have civil conversations. I think I at least sometimes do a decently good job of this, and I know peers who also are able to have these more intellectual debates that don't necessarily devolve into this, well, this is my morals, this is your morals, let's part. But I think that is very much a skill that has to be learned, and I don't think it's something that people, seek out anymore. I don't think, which I think is a kind of a travesty. I think that these people that really want the other side to change their mind you can't do that by yelling at someone. You can only do that by actually sitting down and having a conversation. And the sooner people realize that, quite frankly, the better. Which is really my thoughts on that. Onto what you said about what we can learn from the past and the mistakes of, say, previous generations. I think every single generation attempts to learn from the one before them, both because you are taught by that previous generation And then after you were taught by them, you were also taught by their mistakes. I think that one of the huge changes, or not changes, but one of the huge mistakes of an early generation, which wasn't really a mistake that they knew was coming, was aerosol cans. Aerosol cans basically destroyed the ozone layer and got to a very, very dangerous point. And we realized this was a mistake, and future generations, I think in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, I can't remember the exact year. I think it was during Reagan's era. I'm not fully certain. They realized this was an issue, and they put in actual change. And today, the ozone layer is basically completely recovered. And it was in a very, very bad spot in the past. And I think that's something that needs to happen more. When we notice something has been massively detrimental to the entire world or to a people, we need to do a better job of stopping it in its tracks. Smoking is another example, slightly different example, where we slowly over the course of years realized, hey, this is more and more harmful. And we made an attempt to stop it, and I think we did a very good job of curbing it. I know very, very few people my age that smoke, although a lot of people that vape. Very few people my age smoke, and I think that's a really good thing that's happened. That's a mistake from the past that we've learned on. Obviously, these are much smaller issues. This isn't big things like geopolitics. Those issues are much, much harder to learn from, much, much harder to deal with, because you will end up in situations where it's the newer generation against the older generation within one country, and then you have situations where the older generation from another country is having conflict with a newer generation from another. And you end up in positions like that where very much it is the old guard versus the new guard, but they're kind of on different footing because they're not the same nation. And there is conflict between them because the old guard had conflict with the old guard. The new guard may not necessarily have conflict with that new nation, but conflict is now occurring because it was one-sided. And I've always seen that as kind of how nation rivalries continue. I don't know if that'll necessarily keep happening, but I'd assume so. I'm trying to remember some of the points you asked on. You asked about, you commented on the quote, I think I said evil elites or something like that. I think my main thing with that was not necessarily that all these elite people are evil, obviously. It's just that our nation has very much given them power, and power corrupts, and then obviously absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think there are families that have had an enormous amount of wealth and power in this nation for hundreds and hundreds of years, and an enormous amount of political power as well. If you look towards like the Clintons have been massively powerful in politics for 50, 60 something odd years. These extremely powerful people control our nation very much so, and that probably won't ever stop because these systems were in place originally, and these systems allowed these people to gain power, and then these people gained the power to continue these systems and to make them even stronger to keep themselves in power. And when something like that happens, how do you get out of that? Like how does a nation stop that without literally tearing everything all down? And I don't think that our nation will have a revolution like that. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it can happen. I don't think we're ever going to end up in a place that the French ended up in, where there are people outside of palaces calling for heads. But I think that a lot of young people feel like that's what we need, and I don't necessarily agree with that. But I think that's a lot of the feeling nowadays, where these people have set up the younger generations in our nation pretty much for failure to prop themselves up. And that creates a lot of anger and a lot of resentment in newer generations. Like I was looking for an apartment a little bit ago, and apartments nowadays are extraordinarily expensive when you compare it to the amount of money that someone my age can make. Say, I'm a server right now, and I'm better off than a lot of people are because my job is relatively lucrative and it's relatively based on my own ability. It's not hourly per se. And even I am gonna struggle really hard to be able to pay for college and an apartment and to live. And that very much is not a product of our generation. It's a product of generations ago. And say when the generations of the early 1900s set up the generations of the 50s and the 60s for success, the generations of the 50s and the 60s did not set up the generations of the 80s and the 90s for success. And now my generation's set up even worse. And that's just going to keep getting worse and worse. And that's a lot of resentment nowadays. Pretty much everyone I know my own age is kind of furious about these issues when it comes to just the cost of living and the like your standard of living, your ability to live nowadays, income inequality. All of this is just stacking up against us nowadays.
Well, I think we have to conclude our conversation, but I think your points are of consequence. So you're obviously a bright young gentleman, and walking down a shady lane in life with trust. I'll say you're going to encounter periods of storm and sunshine, both. So I wish you well, and you're obviously going to do well in life. So thank you for coming.
Sure.
Thank you. Thanks.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.